Welcome to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Ola Eriksrud. Ola and I are going to be discussing isokinetics today. Isokinetics are a very different kind of training tool and testing tool that I feel like a lot of people don't quite understand. So we dive into that deeply, and we dive into how you can use a variety of the 1080 products to actually test or train isokinetically. So we go over all of that and so much more. Really deep dive on isokinetics. Great episode today. Great chat with Ola. This episode and every episode in season 5 is sponsored by Isophit. Isophit is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and can help you and your athletes win more and hurt less. For more on Isophit, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Ola, welcome back to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you again. Still talking 1080, but this time slightly different application, more on the isokinetic side, and I'm excited to dive into that with you today.
No, thank you for having me. No, that should be fun and it should be interesting.
For sure, for sure. And
There's a lot to talk about.
there definitely is. And, for people who, like I said before, for people who maybe haven't heard of 1080 and maybe they're not familiar with all the great things that you guys are doing there, would you mind just giving them a little brief overview of what all the products are that you have and all that you guys do that way?
No, sure, absolutely. 1080 motion, motorized resistance devices. We've been around for almost 11 years, so we have a long track record. Motorized resistance device, engine, electrical engine connected to a drum. On a drum is a line. Then there are different engines to give you different things. The engine can provide a lot of force, but not be able to go as fast, or it can go very fast at lower loads or forces. So based upon that, we have the Sprint, the 1080 Sprint, that is, call it a fast one, in that you can go up to 14 meters per second, but slightly lower loads, up to 40 kilograms. Converted that to pound, multiply by 2.2, and then you got your pounds, if people are interested in that conversion. If you're looking at the cable or the quantum, they go much higher in terms of load, but not as high in terms of speed. So it's always this force/velocity trade-off, and that's inherent to the engine. Based on the ecosystem of the machines that we have, we can target anything from sprinting, skating, swimming, repeated cyclical behavior movements, such, using the 1080 Sprint, to more regular, call it, rehab, gym-based, strength and conditioning, to squats, pushes, pulls, presses. That's when the cable and the quantum comes into the mix. So basically be able to overload and target pretty much any kind of movement pattern.
Yeah, no, I love that concept of being able to overload any and every movement pattern. And, I think one of the things that we were talking about not too long ago is that all of your products, whether it's the cable or the quantum and so on that way, have the ability to do a isokinetic type of mode. For people who aren't familiar with what that term is or what an isokinetic type of resistance is, would you mind kind of breaking that down for them as far as like what the isokinetic is and what your products can do in the way of isokinetics?
Think of it as a constant speed. So for instance, if let's say you're doing, many people might know your seated knee flexion, knee extensions. And on those machines, they set a speed, let's say 90 degrees per second, or 180 degrees per second. The point is that the machine will move at a given rate, independent of how hard you're pushing or pulling against it. So if you convert that to, say, a quantum, I'm doing a pull, I can set a speed restriction, meaning that independent of how hard I'm pushing or pulling, the machine will not go faster, and it will adjust its load to maintain its speed. That's how isokinetics works. It's an adjustment of the load or the resistance that it's imposing on you to maintain the speed output of the system. That was overly complicated maybe, but the point is that in essence, it is a variable resistance because based upon where you are in the movement, you're moving at the same rate based upon muscle physiology and how you're built up, how we're all built up. There are certain portions of that range that we can produce more force, and then it might be less. So the machine just maintains the constant speed and just make sure that you cannot push or pull harder than that. So it's trying to maintain a constant speed through a movement. So that's what you set on isokinetic equipment. So your traditional shoulder isokinetic dynamometers, so those for the knee, there we use degrees per second based upon the angle, because that's historically that's how it's been used, because it's been isolated to a single joint, single plane, single direction. And you've been strapped into a chair and you align your knee perfectly with the axis of rotation, and then we set the rate at which you can move. And then you push or pull as hard as you can into that pad, and then you get a recording of how hard you pushed or pulled into that pad. So you get a very nice expression of force through a movement, obviously at slower speeds. And this was the concentric isokinetic that I was talking about right now.
Right, because there's a difference between the concentric and the eccentric isokinetic, correct? It's not one and the same.
Yeah, no, it's not. We call it supramaximal eccentrics when we talk about it. For instance, in the quantum, that's where if I set myself in a position, it could be that I'm standing up. It could be a supramaximal eccentric squat. So I'm standing under the bar. I have two quantums attached to the bar. Those two quantums will pull the bar down with a load so large that you cannot reverse it into a concentric movement. Therefore, a supramaximal eccentric. And you do that obviously at low rates, because you do not want to do this at high rates. And then it's up to you how hard you want to fight it, right? So if I'm standing, with my hips semi-flexed, knees the same thing, the bar is being pulled down and I choose to fight it, and it's up to me how hard I want to fight it. And from that, I get a recording how hard did I push against the bar. And then obviously, the bar is not pulled down beyond the physiological range of that movement. So you have to set a limit because that's a safety consideration. You can set a limit, you can put the locks in place, you calibrate the system so it doesn't go beyond physiological range. And there's even a stop on the user interface that you will stop the machine from moving or reverse it back into the concentric phase. So that's an example of a supramaximal eccentric, and that rate is constant. So it's just going down. Let's say it's going down at 0.1 meters per second. If you move faster, if you're squatting down faster than 0.1 meters per second, there is nothing there. So it's up to you how much you want to fight it. And the same thing goes for the concentric side. If I'm doing a concentric rotational pull, let's say I set the speed limit to 0.4 meters per second, then it's up to me to express force. And the really cool thing about isokinetics is that I don't have to put a large load on anyone for them to express force, because I could have 3 kilograms. So 6, 7 pounds. That is nothing. And then I'm just, I set the speed limit, and then I pull at that speed limit, and it's up to me to express force. And the external load that I impose on someone is literally very, very, very low. And it's up to them to express force. That's why I find it so extremely appealing in rehab and in subacute phases to allow patients to express force through a movement. And that's where you can, with our technology, you can literally choose any movement. It could be a shoulder internal external rotation. It could be a shoulder press. It could be a hip ABA deduction. It could be a rotational pull. Whatever it is that you want to target. But the point is that you empower the patient to be able to express force through the movement, and then you monitor the output. That was an
Right.
extremely long answer, and maybe I got into some other topics in that answer, but my apologies.
No, you're good. I mean, this is a complicated thing, and it's something that, as we were talking about not too long ago, not everyone knows or is familiar with even the term isokinetic in the first place. So, kind of breaking down the difference between concentric and eccentric is essential. And it is really a different way of thinking about exercise in the thought that we're going to keep the speed of movement constant throughout whatever motion we're training and vary the resistance instead of fixed resistance, variable speed. For example, if I look at like the barbell back squat, I might move differently from one rep to the next as far as speed goes or velocity
Yeah.
goes, but the resistance, the weight on the bar didn't change between one rep and the next. So it's a different line of thinking. And you're right, too. You mentioned that historically, this is something that's been mostly used at the knee extension, knee flexion, ACL return to sport test.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so many athletes out there that have horror stories from the chair, they called it, from the return to sport testing and even just a training standpoint. But I think that taking these concepts and applying them throughout the entire body, being able to train more compound movement patterns and more fundamental movement patterns instead of just isolated motions like kicking out straight and then bending back. I think that opens up a whole new world of possibility from both a training standpoint and a rehabilitation standpoint because we're able to train in a way that we wouldn't be able to train otherwise, and we're able to assess data in a way that we would never be able to test otherwise as well.
No, I agree, and and we have to be careful. The speaking of the chair, this is something that has been used for decades, and there's obviously some benefit to it, but there is also some limitations that we have to acknowledge. So if you want to do, and based upon our experience, is that sometimes you do that seated knee, say you do a seated knee extension, and it's not really working out all that great. All right, let's progress it to a close because they get pain. Say it's a patellofemoral irritation or something, right? They get pain, they get discomfort. It's an open chain. Things are not interconnected the way that maybe they're supposed to do in closed chain environments. All of a sudden, you put them in a closed chain environment. You still get a training stimuli on them. Granted, that is distributed over more muscle groups, but you get a stimuli and it's non-painful. So this gives you another tool in that toolbox. I'm talking from a patient rehab perspective now, but it gives you another tool in that toolbox to be able to do different things and play with different kinds of movement patterns because you're not confined and restricted to that specific movement in that chair. Because you can play around because you have something that is a little bit more flexible in its opportunity to target different movement patterns.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point, and it's so interesting that you bring up the patellofemoral irritation because that's a definitely a limitation I've seen in the traditional open chain knee extension isokinetic testing, and it's something that I feel like for many people is still the gold standard for ACL return to sport is, the quad and hamstring metrics we get from isokinetic testing. But especially with some of the BTB graphs, some of the patients I've seen have just had more, prolonged, long-term lasting irritation at the patellar tendon and just general like patellar anterior knee pain. And it just takes a long time sometimes for that to calm down and for that to fully subside. And I found a lot of times that I think athletes are a little bit stronger than they show on the isokinetic standpoint from a testing metric that way is I look at how much I can load them in a closed chain environment and they're able to squat, 500 pounds for reps, but then we put them on the chair and I think the pain becomes the limiting factor and we get this huge notable deficit when in reality, their closed chain function is very symmetrical, very identical. It holds up good on all the other tests. But open chain, sometimes that anterior knee irritation can really become a limiting factor. But it's interesting because, as you mentioned, the chair has been around for decades. And Isokinetic has kind of been the gold standard for decades for a lot of people, like I mentioned. So do you feel like Isokinetics is still the gold standard from a performance testing standpoint, or is this really just a piece to the puzzle that kind of fits in with all the other framework that people are measuring that way from a performance and rehab standpoint? Or where does this concept of isokinetics fit in from a testing standpoint to all the other numbers and data metrics that people are collecting?
I think it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. But that's what it is too. So if we're thinking like performance, I'm going to use one example here because it's going to address that pain thing and it's going to address the deficit thing. One example, we had one international level athlete. He had a 56% reduction quad strength, left side isokinetic. Painful. We took him close chain, Bulgarian split. Obviously, he had and we looked at force. We looked at average force. What we saw then was a rapid increase, massive. Within the first month and a half, it was 150% increase in the average force recordings from a Bulgarian split. That had nothing to do with physiological adaptations. That was basically, ooh, this doesn't hurt anymore. Ooh, I can feel my muscle working. That's what he said too. Like, wow, I'm getting sore. I'm getting like the good kind of sore, not the bad kind of sore. And that's what we saw with the immediate response on him. Obviously, there was a asymmetry starting out left to right for sure. But the pain and the inhibition or the avoidance or whatever, that was obviously marked in that situation. And then to your part of the bigger picture, performance, it's an isolated test of muscle strength at a given rate. That's what it is, if we're thinking about the chair. So if you think about the force velocity relationship, we have targeted an isolated joint and an isolated muscle group at a given rate of movement. And then we think that this is going to predict everything. That is a little far-fetched in my opinion, because we need to complement that with some other things. And if all things line up, sure. But we know also from the literature that there's a certain lower level that we should have. But then again, we need to complement that up with some other tests to see actually how they perform. And as we all know, the biological system is remarkable at quote unquote cheating, and the more elite athletes and elite performers, they're really good at avoiding and camouflaging their weaknesses, so to speak, and using different strategies to be able to accomplish that goal. So there's a certain lower level that we do need and that we know. But the question is, how low is that?
And the other piece to it, as you mentioned, athletes are master compensators. So is it the kind of thing where do we put them in positions where they can't compensate and test them there? Or do we allow them the freedom of movement to move in patterns similar to what they'll move in sport or similar to, how the injury occurred in the first place? So like a, 20 to 30 degree knee flexion angle, pushing from one side to the next, or maybe like rotating through like a chop pattern or something like that, and then test in that position. Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with the quantum product that you have, you're able to actually test isokinetic through those like chop and different diagonal type patterns instead of just like the isolated strength metrics that way.
Yeah, I think there is, we have to be careful to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So there's a time and a place for that. So if we're thinking about a rehab and ACL reconstruction, using that earlier and getting info from that, that is fine. And it could be used as call it a mainstay or something that is constant throughout that process. But then we also need to complement that with some other things.
No, I think you're right, Ola, is ultimately it's a piece to the puzzle and we have to understand how it fits in with everything else. And we also have to understand what we're looking for from a testing standpoint as well. Is I think that if you just go into isokinetics and you think, oh my goodness, I'm ready to test this, I'm ready to test that, but you don't have your variables predefined, you kind of become into more of like a guessing game situation, for lack of a better way to put it. So when it comes to the isokinetics that way, is there any set speeds that you like to have people move at? And how does that vary based on the type of motion you're using or, the muscle group that you're testing or training or so on that way? How do you go about determining what speed to use or set at for the isokinetics?
That's a great question. Yeah, it absolutely varies. And we've obviously been playing around with this for quite some time now. And if I'm doing a calf race, that could have an excursion of say 10 to 15 centimeters, depends on how you do it. Rotational pull depends on your wingspan and how tall you are. Bilateral arm rotational pull, that could have, you know, up to a meter plus excursion. So then the question becomes, if I have something that is very small in terms of excursion versus very large in terms of excursion, do I use the same speed limit? So say if I have 1 meter, and if I put the speed limit at 0.5 meters per second, that means I would have 2 seconds time under tension for that movement. If I do the same speed limit, 0.5 meters per second, for something that is 10 centimeters, that means that I would have 0.2 seconds time under tension, which is massively different. So we normalize this based upon time under tension. And we found that if it is too slow, like if I'm doing like a multi-joint, multi-planar movement, if it's too slow, it's like the sequencing of, like I'm doing a rotational pull and I want to get involvement of the hip and the trunk and the upper body, the arms, the shoulders. If I'm doing it too slow, it's almost becomes, the sequencing becomes off. So what we've been playing around with and been finding is that if you're around 2 to 3 seconds time under tension, that's a really good place to be, because then it seems to, you have that good sequencing of actions and behaviors and movements, and it looks like the movement that it is at higher speeds. So
Interesting.
2 to 3 seconds time under tension, that's how we go about things.
Yeah, so maintaining a 2 to 3 second total time under tension, and that's
Correct.
regardless of if you're looking at a concentric or an eccentric isokinetic.
Definitely for a concentric. And in the software in our new machines, you can walk up to it, you do the movement, it will measure the excursion of the movement, and it automatically set the speed for you. So that's
Interesting.
how we've set up a more of an automated isokinetic for people. Because sometimes you want to do the excursion, you look at the excursion, and then you have to think about math to divide and blah, blah, blah. So we've automated it, this to make it easier for, say, like patients and athletes just to go up and do a couple of, call it reference reps, then boom, go about your business and doing exercises. And when you get that, you obviously then have a very good overview within your set or number of sets. What was the time under tension? And if you have time under tension, and if you're looking at average force, speaking of output, average force is like my go-to variable to look at, because it gives an overall representation of that rep. It's quick and it's easy to get an overview that way. The average force multiplied by the excursion that you did, that's force times distance. Last time I checked, that was work, which means they have a pretty good overview of the work done per rep, per set, per day, and so on and so forth. So
Right.
now you're getting into work, now you're getting into time under tension, and that could be, we're finding that could be very helpful, especially in rehab. It seems to be actually quite good, and that's how we go about documenting these things
I
and thinking
certainly
about. thinking about how we set up the periods and all that stuff. There's a lot of exciting things to be done actually in this domain because we haven't had this available, or people haven't been, we have been using it for years, but we haven't published much on it. We have some interesting case series going, but I think there's a lot of work that we can do in this domain.
I completely agree, and I think it's interesting that you bring up time under tension, or I see it abbreviated as TUT all the time. And I like to do a little play on words with that and call it King Tut, for lack of a better way to put it, because I think if you can master the time under tension of a repetition, you can drastically change what your exercise is doing. It always amazes the patient and client population that I serve when I have them slow down their reps to a 2, 3, or even 4-second tempo sometimes, at just how different it feels and how much more difficult it can be. But on the opposite side of that spectrum is sometimes we really want people to move through functional patterns very quick. And I know that you can do that from an isokinetic standpoint as well. I think from what I saw, you can have people moving like 7 meters per second in the concentric phase with some of your different isokinetic devices. So why would you have someone train at maybe a high velocity concentric or even a high velocity eccentric movement? Because I think you can still move 4 or 5 meters a second in an eccentric. Where would the higher velocity isokinetic type of application, where would that fall in the strength and conditioning and rehabilitation world?
Good question, because this is where we have to be careful.
Right.
Say if I'm setting a speed that is very high, or not very high. Let's say and this was shown in, if we go back to the seated isokinetic dynamometer. The higher the speed, the less of the movement you're actually isokinetic, right? Because it takes you a little time to get to the isokinetic, get to the speed restriction, work with that variable resistance that is just trying to match your output. And then you have to turn off because you're at the end of that movement. So the higher the speed, the less portion of that range you will be doing isokinetically.
Right.
So let's say I'm doing like a rotational pull, and this is where you have to be very careful. Say you go to 1 meters per second. There you can you're getting an acceleration and then you're hitting the speed limit, and that could be very uncomfortable. And that's also where you then have to play with external load. That's where I play with external loading. Because if my instructions always with isokinetic is that I want you to go and I want you to slowly accelerate. I want you to feel the impact of that speed restriction. So it's almost like a familiarization session, the first training session or rehab session. This is where you engage it. Now I want you to play with it. Now I want you to start to express force against it. What can we aim for, like 70%? Okay, can we aim for like 80%? All right, you feel this. All right, I'm not going max. You're getting a feel for it because it's a very new feeling for a lot of people. If I'm going too fast, and the question is, how is too fast? That is obviously very movement dependent. But if I have a higher speed limit, I am accelerating and boom, I'm slamming into that speed limit. That becomes an uncomfortable transition, right? Because I'm accelerating and boom, I'm running into that wall, so to speak. And then it just becomes slow. So that's where you really have to think about how the initial loading is to slow that acceleration down. But that comes at the disadvantage that the range that you're actually going to be isokinetic is probably going to be less. So that's where, in the example that you used there, 7 meters per second, say that is a resisted sprint kind of perspective. So you're getting into some sort of locomotive pattern that won't go any faster regardless of how hard you're pushing against the ground. And then you just keep working at that. So that's one way of slowing people down, right? But again, if you have, say you have a very light resistance and you accelerate pretty good and boom, you hit 7 meters per second and you're wearing a pelvic belt, that's not a comfortable feeling, right? So then you have to have some initial load, so you're coming up to speed, and then you're entering into that isokinetic domain. So if you're going to make that transition at high speeds, you really have to think carefully about the initial loading that you use to ensure that that transition becomes as smooth and as comfortable as possible for the athlete that you're working with.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point.
Be very careful there and know what you're doing and how this works.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I mean, you mentioned it best, even just the concept of like, hey, look, if they are moving that fast, are we really getting any load isokinetically? Is it even true isokinetic? And you mentioned the resisted sprint as well. And I mean, that was a huge staple in our last conversation is the concept of change direction and adding resistance and being able to overload our speed work and kind of build an additional physiological buffer, for lack of a better way to put it, from a strength standpoint. But, while those are great things and allow us to do so many different things, I don't necessarily know if I need to do all of that isokinetically per se.
No, I'm not so sure either. But if you're like, I have this purpose, I want to slow that person down. I want to slow that person down by using a speed restriction. Just know the initial loading that you put on there, and also make sure that you inspect the speed curves afterwards to look at what speeds were they actually assuming, and for what portion of that rep did they actually assume that speed. Because we had an example now of a protocol that was designed with too high external loads and too high speeds, which had the consequence that they called it isokinetic, but the consequence was that a minimum portion of the range was isokinetic. The later portion of that range was isokinetic. So they were doing squats. So initially it was regular isoinertial loading. And towards the end of that movement, they reached the isokinetic domain. So understand where you're getting isokinetics and how much it is. I think that would be my take-home message here.
Yeah, no, I think
those are fairly advanced considerations too. So for instance, if I'm in a patient population, my default is that I go down on the speed. Now I'm talking about isolated or multiplane movements. You're standing in one place. You're not doing any kind of locomotive stuff. I go down on the speed and I go down on the load, and I just allow the patients to explore and express force. That's it. That's all I do.
Yeah, and I think that simple approach, there's sometimes so much value in simplicity that way, because isokinetics, like anything, can become something where we overcomplicate it. And as you mentioned before, there comes a point where we're not even getting isokinetics after a certain point. So if we go too far off the deep end, we have to really tread carefully, because we might be getting something that we're not even assuming we're getting, or getting effects that we're not intending on getting, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, and if you're gonna play with like these more advanced things, definitely try it out on yourself, on your colleagues, and really look at what am I getting? Am I getting what I want, and is it what I'm after? I think that would be, and then you can say, well, I want to use isokinetic speed restrictions at a certain speed in a locomotive pattern just to get people to work in certain positions. Great, wonderful. You have a clear and defined purpose. But then it's almost, you could call it strength, or you can call it technical coaching, you could call it biofeedback, you can call it a whole bunch of things. But if that is your purpose, fine, wonderful. But just know what you're after and then play, And
Yeah,
I agree, like do the simple things. Do the simple things good.
yeah,
Don't get too fancy right off the bat. Because
and
sometimes we can get a little lost then if we get too sexy.
yeah, and just having a thorough understanding for what you're doing and why you're doing it. I'm a firm believer in every action needs to have a purpose in order for every
Yep.
action to have a result. And if you're
Yep.
just grabbing stuff randomly and throwing it against the wall, I'm sorry, but it's not going to move the needle forward. And on that point too, I know we've hit some rehab and some strength and conditioning and some testing different considerations. Say you are using this in more of that performance type setting or strength and conditioning setting. Where does the concept of isokinetic training fit in from a performance enhancement standpoint? Is this something that you're kind of like possibly coupling with, weight room work and a strength and conditioning program? Is it something that kind of gets its own block and a periodization schedule? Is it used more in season, out of season? Where does this piece fit into that puzzle of strength and conditioning framework?
So that's a really good question. I'm going to lean on colleague, friend Matt Price, LA Kings here. They have been using isokinetics from a microdose perspective in season to get a substantial amount of work in a short period of time when they have time to do it, just to get the stimuli. And then they track obviously all sorts of variables throughout that season, and they're looking at, are they able to maintain, or are they decreasing? And these are his words and his reports, but they're able to maintain during an extremely hectic and demanding season in the NHL. So that's one example of how it can be implemented into a strength program. And we actually did a study on this a long time ago. I'm not one of the authors, but colleagues of mine did it at the Olympic Center in Oslo. That's where they did isokinetics versus traditional Olympic style lifting. And what they found was equal or better results in half the time, which to me is quite interesting, because if I go in and I get more bang for my buck, and I think this is where, if I'm doing a traditional Olympic lift, let's squat, all right? Let's go with that one. If I'm having an external loading, I'm having a lot of force early, and then my force level is going to taper off as I get faster and faster towards the end of that lift. This is completely different than the force curve from an isokinetic, because the isokinetic will start out a little bit lower, and then it will just go up, and increase. So if you look at that area under the curve, which is, if you're thinking excursion on the x-axis and force on the y-axis, that area under that curve, that is the work that you did. And the work that you do for every rep is greater, which means that this is where you can get the work consideration in. So which means that, okay, for each movement or rep that I'm doing, I get more work, which means that I could possibly get away with fewer sets and fewer reps, which could fit very well in a busy schedule just to get that stimuli in. And that's what we've been finding. And you have to be careful with it, because we've been finding people that we introduced it and their results went down. And then we started asking questions as to why. And then this was a ski jumper, which means that they obviously body mass and weight is a key performance indicator. So they have to be lean and skinny, which means that nutritional status becomes important. And that was maybe a challenge here, and that was too much actually. Whereas others, boom, just like have a really good increase. So the rep numbers and the set numbers and how often, really think about that in terms of the total work that you do, because I think there is something interesting there.
I completely agree. And I love how you keep bringing up the concept of work, because at the end of the day, work is literally force times distance. And we can apply that into a variety of different exercises, pretty much everything that we do. And we can measure our load metrics that way through work, instead of just like traditional like pounds or kilos lifted or so on that way. And I like how you mentioned, there's a lot of benefit to it, but it seems like the benefit is, we have to understand the dosing. And that's true with anything. There's a therapeutic window. If we do too much, we start to get detrimental effects. If we don't do enough, we get no adaptation. So we kind of have to establish what that optimal, and I hate the word optimal, but in this case, we have to establish what that therapeutic window is for the isokinetic, based on the movement that we're doing, the speed that we're doing it at, but also the overall status of the athlete when they're already probably putting in a lot of work in the sense of, they could be in season, they could be doing 2, 3 hours of practice, they're doing all their other lifting 2, 3 times a week. So really understanding, as you mentioned, having a thorough understanding of how much just, a few sets and a few reps of this is going to tax the musculature and the body as a whole, and then understanding your load and progression accordingly from there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And Bill Maxwell actually did a wonderful case study on this in at Iowa, where he took two identical twins and he looked at isokinetics and their impact that had on. That was just vertical. That was just simple. He said it was just very, very simple, but it was the intent and how much they were pushing and the effect that that had on RSI and all those things. Because I found that interesting because you would say, I think that this is very slow, and how does that then affect, the speed that we're talking about here? Because we have to be able to address that whole speed continuum. So that's an important consideration. So isokinetics has its role and its place. And in terms of readiness and where are we? I use average force and I use their previous training sessions. I go back to it and I'm like, okay, where are we? All right, what was the intent? Okay, what was the target here? And then I'm comparing those values to make sure are we getting better or are we on a declining slope? Because if you come in and I see much lower values, I'm like, time out. We might be doing something very different today because you're not there for whatever reason. That could be psychological, that could be physical, that could be, broke up with the girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. There are many reasons as to why they might not be able to do it. So I use that, and that's where metrics comes in too. So just looking at a simple metric of average force allows me to then gauge a little bit where we're at. And actually also using average force as a feedback and an output to them during a session. All right, that was 1,000. All right, that was 1,050. So I actually do that, provide them that, use it as a biofeedback during the session too. And they will remember. And that they will remember because you don't have too many exercises. So they will remember their target force. Where am I at today? All right, good. All right. Yeah, that's right. Because then you get into these conversations, which can be extremely, we had this conversation earlier, like, the need and the use for the human interaction, right? Because if you give them that feedback and they said, I can't get there today, then you're getting into that conversation, right? Why are we not getting there? Then you get that relationship, you establish that trust. So that data can be used for many, many, many different reasons, but that's one of the things that we use. It creates a conversation. And from that conversation, a lot of benefits can be gained.
No, I think you're spot on about that, Ola, is as soon as we have that conversation, and as you mentioned, incorporating the influence and impact from the athlete and their feedback as well, the more we kind of enhance our ability to do that as a coach, I think the better our outcome is going to be. And the more we bridge the gap between what we learn and understand from a scientific and research standpoint and data standpoint and what the athlete is telling us, the better we're going to be at our job.
No, absolutely. Building that relationship is key. Because theoretically, we could build in algorithms. All right, so now your previous set was this output, now you're this output, now we should do this. We can, that can be built out.
Yep.
But the reason why I was up or down is that only expressed as a force value? No, because it could be a physical thing, it could be a neurological, a pain thing, it could be a psychological, it could be so many reasons as to why it's, for instance, down. And then making adjustments based upon that purely by a machine, I think you're losing something.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that.
You're losing something there, which is we have to be careful not to lose that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like we could probably talk about isokinetics all day long, and I feel like we covered a lot of great points as far as where they fit into the puzzle, why we need to be careful with them, and the overall application of the isokinetics thus far from both a rehab and a strength and conditioning standpoint. Is there anything that we missed or anything that we didn't bring up as we were chatting today, Ola?
Yeah, it could be. Well, we touched a little bit on periodization and dosing. Usually go with 1 or 2 sessions well, obviously it depends on the athlete. 1 or 2 sessions a week. For a given movement, my start go-to kind of setup is 3 sets, 5 reps. If I see that the average force of the last set is similar or better to the first, I might go with a fourth. And then usually when you're seeing fatigue coming in, you see just average force rep after rep just declining, and all right, we're done. And that is with the necessary rest between sets. So usually rest, obviously we can talk about rest between sets, but for these we usually use 3 or 4 minutes rest between sets, which means that if you're doing 3 sets of 5, you're looking at 12, 13 minutes. So in that session, you don't have room or place for too many things, right? So you just have to pick the movements carefully as to what you want to target, or is it a lower body day, or is it an upper body day, or how you set that up. And 48 to 72 hours between probably is necessary. At least that's what we've seen, especially starting out with this kind of stimuli. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is that if you do a all-out max session, call it a test session. So say you do 5 reps, you get the average force. Here you can choose to use the average of the average force, meaning the average of those 5 reps. You can use the best one. To be more robust, I would probably take multiple reps in to get a good indicator where they're at. Then use this as a target, because you might not want to go all in. That's another thing that we found. If you go all in 100% session after session after session, you see that plateauing. So then usually we do a little dip and we might go down to 80%. So say your average was 1,000 newtons. Now your target force for this session is 800 newtons. So then we can adjust it based upon different test sessions through that continuum of care or that training program. So that's a little bit of how you could piece it together, from a progression / periodization perspective. So I just wanted to share that a little bit, because that's been a little bit of our experiences there.
Yeah, and on that point too, you mentioned about the rest periods and different things that way. It could be the kind of thing too where you could still do something during the rest period, just understand what you're doing, right? So like if I'm doing an isokinetic squat, for example, and I do my 5 reps and then I've got, a 3-minute rest period before my next set, potentially I could use that time and hit some like basic like prone swimmers or like body weight, Blackbird
Yeah.
ITY or something like that. Like, just because I'm resting doesn't mean that the time has to be, fully spent just not doing anything. There's still, if I'm working a full body session that way, there's other things that I could probably plug in and kind of fill those gaps that are still, applicable to the athlete as a whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But say you're doing a squat, I probably would not touch the legs during that rest.
Right.
Because especially if they're going hard, then leave that alone.
Right, but mix in a little upper body work, some isometrics. I like to think that all like arm training is pretty low intensity that way. So even if your guys are going to grab some dumbbells and hit 5 or 6 hammer curls real quick, like that's probably not going to mess with the recovery for the squat that much.
No, I don't think that could be done. Absolutely.
So you can
So
certainly make the most of your time.
yeah, and like to me, the the biggest shift and the change I see in how I do things from a rehab. And I think this type of resistance has a massive application in rehab. We've published some cases and published some things on it in terms of rehab applications, but I think it has some wonderful. We published one case study. All right, I'm going to finish off with this. We published one case study. This was a ATP tour tennis player, grade 3A, internal abdominal oblique strain, left side. All right, so one of the authors, brilliant tennis coach, we went through the literature. Okay, what's the frontal plane angular momentum of the trunk? Very important, and it happened during serve. Frontal, and it was a left side, right-handed player, so frontal plane, left side, obviously very important. Sagittal plane, trunk has a contribution as well as the transverse plane. So then we did unilateral shoulder press, standing. We did a bilateral arm overhead, anterior reach kind of thing to get the sagittal. We did a anterior diagonal inferior push to get the sagittal plane and the transverse plane. And then we use symmetry, left, right. We use also the numerical rating scale. We don't want the pain during this movement to be greater than 3 out of 10. So we use that to modify a little bit the intensity of the athlete. And then one of the cool things that we did from this was that we said symmetry was a return to play, at least conversation. He was probably asymmetric to begin with because he's right-handed and he'd been playing on the tour for a long time. So that would be to be expected. And then those data and talking about that with the athlete and they using the data as a part of understanding why we probably were not ready to return to play became very, very important. So I think the applications into the rehab domain is massive. We can have a whole talk on tendon and how we apply it to tendon. That's a different conversation, but we're doing some cool things with that in terms of tendon and tendon rehab.
Yeah, and I think at some point we will probably have to do a entire podcast on tendons at some point because you're right, that's a whole can of worms and it varies between one tendon and the next as well, the different physiology and morphology. So
and function and the functionality, based upon that structure and morphology and how it works within the context of others within the whole body. So the patella versus the Achilles, obviously, that's like a good example there. But I think these kind of things, early phase rehab, there is a huge untapped potential that I see.
I completely agree.
So I'm obviously biased here, but I go to this actually quite fast, and I load people up like this with isokinetics quite fast because it's very low external load, and I allow the patient to be the boss. They express force, and we have an agreement. You're not going to go above 3 out of 10. That's our deal. And then we have to have that trust that is the case. And then they report back, and then okay, so let me know how you feel this evening. I also want you to document tomorrow morning. How is that? All right, we're good. All right, let's go. So that's how we work when it comes to that.
I love that. And I completely echo your point too on loading early on in the rehab standpoint, because I think that can really make the difference later on in the process. Ola, for people who want to find out more about you and want to find out more about 1080, where can they learn more about you guys?
You can look, homepage, 1080motion.com. That's obviously a good resource. And so I touched on some of the science, and some of the publications are actually located under the science section there. So we put out, different scientific productions that we and others are involved in. We put there. So you get info about applications and equipment, and then you have social media, the same thing. The Instagram, the LinkedIn, the Facebook. Not so much TikTok as of now. As for me personally, you find me on LinkedIn. You also find me on Instagram and Facebook, but also at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, where I work as an associate professor. You find my info there as well.
Man, it's a shame you're not on TikTok, Ola. I was really looking forward to
Yeah, no, that would be beyond embarrassing. That's
Oh man, we'll have to see the 1080 sprint dance series coming soon, I guess.
yeah, why not? Yeah, why not?
Or 1080 speed. Ola, really appreciate your time. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, man. Thank you so much for everything.
No, thank you for having me.